Do you know how ancient the practice of fasting is?
It goes back as far as the records can tell us, and in religions all around the world, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Christians, every faith seems to have a tradition of fasting. It's seen as a way of sharpening our devotion to God, sharpening our senses, and that reminds you in the most direct human ways of your commitment to the divine.
Welcome back to the For All the Saints podcast. I'm delighted and frankly honored to be hosting Daniel Peterson today. We're talking about, well, we'll see where it takes us, but I wanted to learn a bit more about Ramadan and Islam and its connections to our own theology, because I'm a big believer of strengthening interfaith dialogues and all of that. I think it's really helpful. But I would say, firstly, a basic question of what is Ramadan, because it's going on at the moment, and what are the origins of Ramadan?
Right. Well, Ramadan is one of the lunar months of the Islamic calendar, and so it doesn't map neatly onto to any month in the Julian or Gregorian calendar that we're familiar with. It moves through the year because lunar months are shorter than the months that we have in our year. So the name actually comes from an Arabic root that has to do with the searing heat, which suggests to me that at one point it was probably not a lunar month. It was sometime in the summer. Of course, in Arabia, searing heat is not uncommon at any time of the year. But I used to be amused, or I am amused sometimes when I hear international weather broadcasts and they go through the regions of the world. And then for Arabia, they say the weather today hot and dry. And I think, well, you could just record that and it would be true any day of the year, just about. But it's a pre-Islamic month. And then according to Islam, it's the month in which the revelation of the Quran began. So they commemorate that. In fact, some views say, well, the entire Quran was brought down to the lowest heaven, right above the earth, to be ready to be parceled out to Muhammad over the course of the next several years, but that it all came down on during Ramadan, during one particular night in Ramadan. But in commemoration of that, Muslims have taken on this practice of fasting and reading the Quran intensively during that period and so on. But it's the holiest time of the year for Muslims. It's a time of renewal, recommitment to their faith, re-immersing themselves in its practices and its scripture. So very, very important for Muslims. And yeah, we're still in it right now as we speak. It'll be ending in a few days, but it's hugely important. And I would just say, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, that in my experience in the Islamic world, I think that observance of Ramadan is stronger now than it has been at any point that I can remember. So there's been a kind of recommitment to the idea.
Right. Is it so is Ramadan, is there a separate name for the festival or the commemoration, or is it just so
They
strongly
simply
associated
say,
with the month?
yeah, Ramadan, they associate it with the whole month. And so the fasting practices go on for that entire lunar month, which can be 29 or 30 days, depending on where the moon is observed and so on.
Right, because I'm seeing in some of the supermarkets, Eid al-Fitr
Yeah.
or Eid Mubarak. Obviously, Ramadan Mubarak is kind of the greeting, right? It's
Yeah.
sort of like us saying Happy Christmas or something.
Right. Right. Yeah. Eid.
Oh,
Um,
Eid.
Eid. Yeah.
Apologies.
Well, it's all right. Eid means feast. And so when they say Eid Karim, Eid Mubarak, something like that, it means blessed feast. But they're referring to Ramadan. And there are other Eids
Right.
throughout the Islamic year, although this is the most important one. And then Ramadan Mubarak, Ramadan Karim, they'll say a generous, noble Ramadan, or blessed Ramadan. So those are the common greetings during this time.
Right. And is there a specific significance to why they, or the time of day that they eat? Obviously, they have big get-togethers and gatherings in the evenings.
Right.
Um,
It has to do with the rising and the setting of the sun. You're not supposed to eat or drink or participate in some other activities during the sunlight, and so you can eat until the sun rises. And the traditional rule was you can eat until you can distinguish a white thread from a black thread by the light of the sun. Um, and that's when the fasting commences, and then it ends in the evening when the sun goes down, or when you can no longer distinguish a white thread from a black thread.
Gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So what it has sometimes meant, we noticed it particularly when we were living in Egypt, in Cairo, that if you were driving along the roads at about sunset, first of all, the traffic in Cairo is horrendous. I've called the city an urban apocalypse. It's just, although the traffic is much safer now than it used to be because it basically doesn't move. So it's hard to have a serious accident. But the traffic would be very low at that time because everybody was encamped along the banks of the Nile River, waiting, just waiting, knife and fork in hand, almost, for the sun to go down, being time to eat. So they take that very seriously, and so yeah, you do see things slow down around sunset time because everyone is hungry and thirsty and they're ready to eat.
I do really appreciate it when I see, obviously being in the UK, there's you live, especially where I am. You see quite a lot of the of people who belong to that faith, and it's great to see that strict observance of it,
Yes.
and the seriousness with which they take that month of Ramadan and the observance of it. It's quite refreshing in
Yeah.
today's world.
Yeah, I
Um,
actually am moved by it and impressed by it, and I I always tell people who are traveling in the Middle East, just if you're going to eat, and of course as a non-Muslim, you probably will eat during the daylight hours. Just don't make a spectacle of yourself. It's rather cruel to walk in front of people licking an ice cream cone or something like that. Just
yeah, of course.
read about it. Try not to rub it in their face.
Do
um,
you, do you know how ancient the practice of fasting, across cultures, but fasting with that kind of prayerful heart
yes.
is? I mean, obviously, we go back to biblical times, but how far is this? As far as like, did Adam and Eve do this? Do we know of?
They
Would we
may
guess?
have. I mean, it goes back as far as the records can tell us, and in religions all around the world, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Christians, every faith seems to have a tradition of fasting at some point in the year, regularly. It varies, but the practice is similar across faiths and across cultures in the sense that it's seen as a way of sharpening our devotion to God, sharpening our senses in to divine things, and alerting us, maybe sensitizing us to the plight of the poor and things like that. So you find it everywhere. I've seen descriptions of it as interrupting our daily routine, and so it reminds us of our commitment to God. That is, normally when you're fasting, you'll suddenly think, "Oh, I'm thirsty. I'll get a drink," and then you think, "No, no, I can't." Or I'm feeling a little hungry right now. I think I'll grab a snack. Oh, wait a minute. Get my hand out of the cupboard and and stop it. And that reminds you in the most direct human ways of your commitment to the divine, in things that you would normally just take for granted on any given day of the week. You just can't during the fasting period, and that's a good way of concentrating your mind, I think, and reminding yourself of your commitments.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's interesting hearing that. And what comes to my mind is the parallel between the approach in ancient times compared to modern times. And contemporary fasting is very, as many things are, very secular. I wonder how often people fasted um, further back in time purely for those physical reasons. And if there's
Yeah.
ever been a time like today, or as much of as today, where it has been so, I'm trying to articulate, I can't find the word, um, had so little affiliation with the religious or with the divine or with the spiritual as
Well,
today.
just as an experiment a while back, I looked up the word fasting on Google. And all I came up with for a couple of pages was intermittent fasting, health benefits of
Yeah,
fasting, things like that. Nothing about fasting as a practice in Judaism or Islam or Christianity. It was all about the possible benefits of skipping a day, for your body, because that's what we're focused on now. So, no, I don't think. I'm not sure that I'm not aware of any statements from the ancient world or the medieval world that, well, forget about God. This is good for you. You should
yeah,
do this. Now, sometimes people recommending fasting will say, well, it's good for you, but not necessarily as a matter of improving your fitness or cardiovascular fitness or increasing your longevity. It's more that it will develop discipline in you. You will learn to put your commitments, your mind, your spirit over your body, and bring it into submission, which is always a good lesson. I mean, it's part of growing up, I think, is to learn to discipline yourself for a goal that's further off in the distance. I mean, if you ask a child, do you want an ice cream cone now, or would you like to have 5 ice cream cones in an hour? The younger child will almost always say, I want mine now. They can't think an hour in advance or can't hold off that long. Um, and so part of growing up, I think, is learning to defer gratification. You study something really hard because you want to get a really good job later on. The payoff is not immediate. And with fasting, that's certainly the case. You're hungry, you want it right now, but you tell yourself, no, no, I won't, for
yeah.
some grander purpose.
Delayed gratification is kind of not a thing today
Right.
much
That's right.
anymore. I wonder if those times in history where it may have been more of the less important spiritual aspect of fasting. We don't know about them because people were too busy telling people to repent.
Right.
In those parts of Scripture. Um, but I wonder, does the practice or the concept of fasting differ much between Islam and the Latter Day Saints in terms of not only its kind of how they're taught about it, but in the promised blessings of
Yeah.
it?
Not hugely, I think. We're told, and we have the practice. Of course, we fast once a month on Fast Sunday, but we can fast at other times if a person knows that he's going to be giving a blessing to someone, a child or a grandchild or something like that, then we can have a fast at any time. I know patriarchs who fast when they know they're going to be giving a patriarchal blessing the next day, to bring themselves into closer harmony with God. And a Muslim, I think, would understand that. In fact, I've found in my discussions with Muslims, especially around and in Ramadan, that it's they resonate immediately as soon as I say, "Well, we have a practice of fasting too." Now, of course, they fast for an entire month from sun up till sundown, so it's both a longer fast and a shorter one, in a way. Where we fast once a month on a regular basis for 24 hours or roughly 24 hours. So it's a little bit different, but they immediately say, oh, okay, I understand. That makes sense to us. We can see why you do it and what the benefits are. I mean, I think we're very much on the same page in that regard. Not maybe quite in the details, but in the general idea, very much on the same page.
It's interesting that because we probably have that sort of fellowship much more than many other groups
Yeah.
in the world with fasting. But I mean, I think of fast and testimony meeting, which, as you said, for anyone who's watching and doesn't know, we do once a month on the first Sunday of the month traditionally, and we fast. And that meeting, rather than having uh, pre-prepared talks, we have sort of 45 minutes where anyone can go up to the pulpit and share their kind of witness of Jesus Christ or God. And I remember after the COVID lockdowns, when we came back to church after having been away from it a while, I remember the first testimony meeting that I went to, and I thought, gosh, I can't remember it being this strange of an experience, kind of so unique. Um, but I mean, would that kind of thing resonate with Islam as well? Is there any sort of I can't. I don't think I've seen in other cultures this kind of link between this sort of public expression.
They don't bear testimony in the same way. They don't have a testimony Friday or anything like that.
Yeah,
But I have heard Muslims talk about how it has really, brought them closer to God. And ideally, it's not just going without food. I mean, that for us too, it shouldn't be just that. You just don't go hungry for 24 hours.
yeah,
You There's some other practices you should do: read the scriptures, pray, do good acts. There are all sorts of things that we can do, but it's just not a matter of being hungry. There's something more uh, than that. And Muslims too will read the Quran, and really devout ones will read the entire Quran during the month of Ramadan. In
wow,
fact, printed editions of the Arabic Quran are divided up into 30 ajza, they're called, plural of juz, which means sections. And it's marked in the margins so that you read one a day. And if you just follow the marks in the margins of your Arabic Quran, that will divide it up into 30 nice portions for your Ramadan reading. And many Muslims do that. By no means all, but many do. And so that adds a spiritual dimension to their fast. So they would understand that too, from us, that we say, well, it's fasting and prayer should go together. And just going hungry doesn't do it. I sometimes have skipped a meal for one reason or another, but not for spiritual reasons. That's a very different experience than deliberately going without food for a spiritual reason, because you're going to attend the temple for a relative, or something like that. Whatever motive we may have, or just the regular monthly fast. It isn't complete if it isn't done prayerfully. The Muslims have a good term for that, I think. They call it niyya, which means Niyya, which means intention. And they say, look, you can do all sorts of things that are outwardly conforming to the rules, the commandments, but if you don't do them with niyya, or if you do them with the wrong niyya, the wrong intention, then they don't count. So, it's like Jesus talking about, if you're fasting to be seen of men, if you're giving alms to be seen of men, then okay, that's an intention, but it's not the right one, and it won't count for anything for you. Likewise, just skipping meals without really thinking about why you're doing it is not adequate. Maybe a step in the direction, but it's not enough.
that's fascinating. I had no idea of that. Niyya,
Mm.
Niyya.
Yeah,
I love that. I love that. That you studied Islam and Arabic studies at Brigham Young University. You've written several books
yeah,
about the subject,
yeah.
and a lot of articles as well that I've really enjoyed reading in preparation for this. Um, and but why did you choose to study Islam in such depth and write about Muhammad and other things like that?
Well, it's a curious thing. I went to the university with very different intent. I was studying mathematics. I wanted to be a cosmologist. I was interested
Wow.
in Big Bang and things like that. And I soon discovered that, I didn't think I was all that good. Good enough, but not great. And it wasn't really my passion. That wasn't what I woke up in the morning wanting to do. I wanted to study the ancient world and so on. And so I studied Greek, and I studied philosophy, and then I heard Hugh Nibley. Some will recognize that name as a really great and influential, pivotal Latter-day Saint scholar. Gave a speech once in which he said, well, whatever you're doing, drop it. Study Arabic. I think he was in one of his Arabic phases. There were about 3 or 4 of them over his lifetime, and they didn't last very long necessarily. But he was in one then, and he got me. And so I decided I would do that. But I was going on my mission. When I was called on my mission, I was assigned to the Switzerland Zurich mission, German speaking. But there was also a set of papers on me, apparently, that had me going off to Beirut, Lebanon. I didn't know about that until my stake president set me apart and said, well, I hope you enjoy your time in Lebanon. And I said, excuse me? And he showed me his papers, and they said Beirut, Lebanon. I didn't know until I arrived in Switzerland where I was going to spend the next 2 years. I asked the mission president, and he said, no, you're staying here in Switzerland. As it happened, my best friend at the time was assigned to the Switzerland Zurich mission, but he was sent on down to Lebanon. But the reason was that Switzerland was neutral. And in those days, before we had what's called the international mission, um, the Swiss mission was used to run just about everything in Africa, north of the Congo, and everything in Asia, all the way over to including Afghanistan, and the Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, everything. So there was a district of missionaries under the Swiss mission in Beirut, Lebanon, but I was never sent there. So that kind of piqued my interest. And when I came back, I began studying it seriously, and then went off and lived in Israel and in Egypt for a total of about 4.5 years, and came back and did a PhD at the University of California at Los Angeles. So yeah, the reason I did it was I thought there's nobody in the church at that point, I thought, that was studying Islam seriously. Now there are a fair number, but in those days there was just nobody.
Right.
So I thought, well, it's wide open territory for a Latter-day Saint to look at and see what can be made of it.
And you're such a renowned Latter-day Saint academic or defendant. I don't necessarily like the term apologist, but kind of,
Right.
you would associate with that, I guess. And
Yeah.
so, was there anything in terms of culture or kind of, I've heard the term religious jealousy
Mhm.
from being such a stalwart Latter-day Saint, but also being so engaged in the study of that religion?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people think that the work I've done in defending our beliefs indicates that I hold other religions in contempt, but I don't. And I have a great deal of respect for Muslims and for others. I can say, in all honesty, that I've felt what I consider the spirit in mosques during worship services. I don't back away from the claim that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Lord's church, that He's established it, that it's authorized by Him. But can the spirit be felt elsewhere? Yes, absolutely. And are there authentic religious sentiments and truths in Islam? Absolutely, yes. And so I had one experience when I was studying in Cairo. It was really kind of fun. I spent about 6 months studying with a very famous Dominican Catholic priest, Father George Anawati, who was an authority on Islamic philosophy and the history of Islamic thought. And so I had the opportunity of studying one-on-one with him, reading texts in Arabic. And he was fascinated, by the way, by the fact that I was a Latter-day Saint. He had for a long time taught one term each year at the University of California at Los Angeles, from which on certain points on campus you can see the Los Angeles Temple. He was fascinated by that. So he would come in and he would ask me all sorts of questions about the church. He'd bring in tea one day and said, "Would you like some tea?" "Oh, no, you can't have tea, can you?" And then he'd bring in coffee the next week. "Oh, sorry, you can't have coffee." One day he brought in a Cadbury's chocolate bar, and I grabbed it. And he said, "Oh, I guess you can eat chocolate." I said, "Yes, I can." So, but he was constantly talking to me about the church. He was really intrigued by it, and every once in a while we'd read a passage and he'd say, "Now that is really beautiful." He said, "I've used that passage in my sermons." And he said, "I'll bet you can too." Now he must have thought that I was something like a Latter-day Saint clergyman or something like that. But he said, "But you can use these in your sermons. You don't have to identify where they come from. Truth is truth, just cite this as an illustration." And I confess, I've pulled that stunt a couple of times where I just quote something in a prayer meeting or something, and people think, "Oh, wasn't that a nice thought? Where did that come from?" Well, that came from Islamic philosopher so-and-so, or actually it's from the Quran. They say, "Well, it sounded true." Well, it is. There are truths in all the major faiths, and some very eloquent statements of faith and truth. So I have never felt any need to denounce Islam or anything like that. Now, obviously I'm not a Muslim, but do I respect Islam and Islamic faith and Muslims? Yes, very much.
How have you? This is kind of a different question to what I was kind of not on the topic that I was pursuing originally, but I do think it's an interesting, thought-provoking point of sometimes, especially in the role of a missionary, I was worried to, especially we had an occasion with. I have many good Baptist friends, but on this occasion, I was faced with quite an aggressive Baptist who had come up and wanted to debate, wanted to debate. And I wasn't really that kind of guy, I wasn't up for a debate. If
Right.
I'd much rather you do your best in your own faith if you're going to be vehemently against mine.
Yeah.
Uh, but it led me to thinking, what is the kind of, obviously, people in Islam will want everyone else to be with them in Islam. And in an ideal world, we would like everyone to be a Latter day Saint.
Yeah.
Where is that kind of boundary with missionary work versus kind of respecting and kind of you do your thing?
Yeah, I'm much more interested in expounding what I believe and seeing if that catches them in any way, it intrigues them, catches their interest, piques their curiosity, than I am in attacking their faith.
Mm.
I don't like to do that at all. I was sort of pigeonholed on my mission as a debater. I remember one time though when I pretty definitively said I don't want to do this anymore. Some missionaries set up a discussion with a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it turned out that one of the local big leaders in the Jehovah's Witness movement had decided to come, and they were terrified. So I was in the mission home at the time, and they asked me if I would come down to their place in Zurich and meet him. And I have to say, and this sounds self-serving, but he wasn't as good as I had thought he might be. And I thought I kind of mopped the floor with him, to be honest. Um, but did it make me feel good? No, it made me feel terrible. I didn't like it at all. The spirit was absolutely gone. And I wrote to them afterwards and said, don't ever ask me to do that again. I don't want to do it. I didn't feel it did any good. It just humiliated the poor guy. But it didn't move him 1 inch toward, a sympathetic understanding of our beliefs, let alone conversion. I just don't see the value of it. But I like the approach that George Albert Smith gave of saying, look, you have truth. We have things that we believe are truth. Let us see if we can add to what you have. And if this interests you, great. If you decide not to, well, okay. As you say, if they're not going to become Latter-day Saints, then I want them to be the best Catholics or Muslims or Presbyterians or whatever it might be that they can be. Live up to the best that you've got. You'll be fine, I think, if you try to do that. In the long term, I feel confident that people who really seek the truth will find it. Maybe not immediately, maybe not on our timetable, but they will. But in the meantime, there's an awful lot of truth and a lot of challenging moral demands in Islam and in Catholicism and in all the major world religions, more than most people can ever begin to live up to. So there's plenty to work on in the meantime.
Yes, absolutely. I had many experiences of my mission, not in debates, but I remember we had met with, and again, I preface these always. Maybe I'm just a people pleaser, but I always preface these stories with, I have some friends who are, who are great people who are Jehovah's Witnesses, but I remember sat down with a Jehovah's Witness missionary, and I didn't know they were a missionary, but they had sort of agreed to meet with us. I thought we were teaching them a lesson, and it turned out not to be the case. So I just left with a testimony, and as a young kind of 19-year-old Ben was sharing his heartfelt testimony, this guy belly laughed in my face. I thought, oh gosh, I don't enjoy this. You do your thing,
Yeah,
I'll do mine.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I don't like that kind of encounter. I'm much more like the kind that is friendly and mutually respectful. A friend of mine operates a little foundation in which he tries to create such dialogues. One of the things he insists on first, before the quote debate or the discussion, is he wants them to have dinner together, and they're forbidden to talk about religious issues. He wants
that's
them to come
fascinating.
together as people over a good meal. Just tell me about your family. Let me tell you about my kids, my grandkids, whatever. And he says, then that creates a much better frame of mind for going into the discussion. And the way he puts it is, he says, and this is stronger than I would put it, and he's joking more or less, but he says he wants the attitude to be, um, you're going to hell, but I feel really bad about it. So, because I like you. Instead of you're going to hell and ha ha ha, I look forward to seeing you roasting in the flames.
That's so fun. I do think there's a great place for uh, a good measure of religious envy, but in a positive way.
Yeah,
I've heard people say in other faiths that they are, for example, jealous of our missionary
right.
system, which is obviously fantastic and it's amazing for the missionaries and also amazing for getting the message out.
Yeah,
But then I also look at a lot of Orthodox Christian organizations and feel sometimes quite envious of their the mysticism with
right.
which they um, explore that, and actually that can benefit us and enhance it. I've got this new artist. I love his work. He's called Library of Godwin.
Hmm.
And he kind of infuses that mysticism into his artwork, but he's focusing on Latter Day Saint art and topics,
Oh,
and it's really beautiful. I recently found it and have been talking to him, and it's really beautiful. So but that's a way where we can sort of enhance our faith and viewpoint.
yes. I've talked about that a fair amount. I said, look, I don't actually like the word tolerance, religious tolerance, because that conveys to me the idea that, well, I hold my nose and I permit you to exist, but I regret
Yeah,
it, that kind of thing. I would much rather have us engage in mutual appreciation, that there are things that you do that I envy, that I could maybe even incorporate it in my practice to some degree. It doesn't mean necessarily that I want to convert. It means that I see you doing things that sort of put me to shame, or that's too negative, that make me think I could be better at this. It goes back to a principle that Christer Stendahl enunciated. He used to be the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm and the dean of Harvard Divinity School in the United States. But he talked about what he called holy envy, where you look at another religious faith and you think, they do that really well. When I look at the Amish or the Mennonites, I don't want to become Amish. I don't know if you're familiar with them. We
yeah.
have them in the United States that still drive buggies and carriages and don't use electricity or things like that. I don't want to do that, but they and their more moderate cousins, the Mennonites, live simple lives, not ostentatious, not devoted to the commercial rat race or that sort of thing. And I think, well, that's a good caution to me. Maybe I could be doing better in that direction. Do I really have to have all of the latest trinkets and gadgets? Am I spending too much time on consumerism? Or with Muslims, one of the things that I've been struck by is the reverence they have for their scriptures. They won't put the Quran on the floor. They won't put it under other books. They won't mark it up. They treat it with respect. And when a copy of the Quran is old and worn out, they dispose of it almost ceremonially rather than just tossing it in the garbage can. Um, Now, do I need to follow all those practices in detail? No, not necessarily. I mean, I have sets of scriptures that are marked up. I think that's good practice in some cases. But the respect for the book, treating it respectfully and reverently, I think is not a bad thing to learn from, at least to contemplate and think, well, how could I adapt that and bring it into my practice? Muslims are really good at being Muslims 7 days a week. Latter-day Saints are not bad at that either. Many Christians are not. You go to church for a couple of hours or an hour on Sunday, and that's it. You live the rest of your week as if you were not a Christian at all. Um, I like the fact that Islam brings their religion forward in their lives every day of the week. You have the 5 daily prayers every day of the week if you're a devout Muslim. So we talk about having a prayer in our hearts all the time, but in fact, sometimes we can go a long time without a serious prayer. But a Muslim can't. If he's following the rules, 5 times a day, he takes a break or she takes a break and prays to God and shows submission to God. It's a good reminder.
It was a wonderful reminder, actually. I lived in I have so many stories from my mission just because it was so impactful on me. And, I'm not going out into far-flung places most weeks. And one of our apartments was right next to a mosque. And as you say, that reminder of hearing the prayer happen. And
Yeah.
it was almost kind of a reminder to me to, oh, well, maybe I should say a prayer,
Right.
why not? And I was teaching a family from Pakistan who it was kind of a part member family, but they came from that culture of course, of where the nation is primarily Islam. And I walked into their living room, their front room, and I put my scriptures and my teaching materials down on the floor next to my feet. And gosh, I didn't anticipate the backlash that I would have received. You must have more respect for that. We keep our Book of Mormon, our Bible, all of our holy books at the top of the room, and
Right.
because of that culture. And yeah, well, I got about a 10-minute lecture from them. But, I never put my Book of Mormon on the floor again. I don't necessarily religiously keep it at the
Right.
very top of the room, but that taught me a really profound lesson. So I think
Oh,
that's wonderful, and it goes back to what we were expressing about Ramadan
yeah.
at the start, which was it is inspiring to see that traditional strict observance, and that's yeah. Were you going to say something
Well,
there?
your story is very Muslim. I've had that same experience. I remember when I first arrived on the faculty at BYU, I had a student from Jerusalem who was a Muslim. His dad was also some sort of communist, I think, because his name was Castro Hamid. I thought was a really interesting name. Uh, but at one point, he said to me, "Look, you guys don't take your religion seriously." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he was really kind of indignant. It was the fact that he saw students come in and they'd have a copy of the scriptures, maybe a cheap edition of the Book of Mormon, a paperback edition, and they'd put it on the floor. And he said, "If you were serious about your religion, you wouldn't do that." Well, I tried to explain to him that it was just a cultural difference, and we don't venerate the physical book in quite the same way they do. But still, I thought that's an interesting observation and maybe something to contemplate. And I've had experiences like that with others, well, one in particular, I'll tell you, I had a graduate student, colleague, friend, who was a Pakistani imam who had come to my graduate school to do an American PhD in Islamic studies. And we were talking one day about, well, getting together the next day to study for a final exam or something like that. And I said, "Well, I'll see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock in room whatever." And he looked at me like he was expecting more. And I said, "Well, 2 o'clock, right? And such a room." And he still looked expectant, and he said, come on." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Say inshallah, if God wills." And so I said, okay, inshallah. If God wills, we'll meet tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And then I got a lecture for him very, very kindly. But you arrogant Westerners, you think that, you're in control of your destiny, but you're not. You could drop over of a heart attack at any moment or be hit by a car. So if God wills, we'll meet tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And I've never forgotten that. It was very kindly. We were friends and we were still friends. But I thought, well, yeah, I get that maybe sometimes we think our destiny is completely in our hands, and it's not. Every once in a while you hear a case of someone who passes away suddenly, and that the day before they were planning a party that weekend or a vacation they were going to take, and suddenly that's just off the table. It's not going to happen. And so our destiny is really not entirely in our hands. And that's another thing I envy about Islam. I think that sense that you're not really in charge. You're not the captain of your fate, the master of your soul. Not entirely. You have a lot of control, but not ultimate control. That's worth remembering. And I think, yeah, Ramadan helps to instill that sense of humility in people and their dependence on God. So it's a very valuable lesson, I think, to be reminded of that once a year for an entire month.
Hmm. Um, I wonder what are the key messages or tenets of the Quran.
I would say centrally important is that there is one God and that we're morally accountable to Him. I think that's really, really crucial. That's central. That people in this world who think that they can just do whatever they want and they will never stand to account are wrong. And so, quite often, the Quran will talk about those who believe in God and affirm the last judgment. It's really about moral accountability in the end. Um, so, the very word Islam means submission. So, a Muslim is a submitter, someone who submits, and it's not to tyrants or to cultural fashions or something like that. It's submission to God. So the ideal Muslim in many Muslim writings is Abraham, because at the command of God he nearly sacrificed his son, even though it went against everything he wanted and had believed. But convinced that God had asked him to do it, he was willing, and then fortunately didn't have to go through with it. But that idea of submission to God's will, however painful it may be, however demanding it may be, I think that's a really central concept too, and enshrined in the very name of the religion, and also in the gesture of prayer, which is, the formal five liturgical prayers, I call them, 5 times a day. Um, involve prostrating oneself before God and touching the forehead to the ground. It's a symbol of complete submission before an earthly Oriental monarch. That's the way you would do it, but this is before God.
Right. And does Islam and the Quran intersect at all with the Bible,
Yeah,
in terms of not just in matter of the principles it teaches, but actually in geography and in
yes.
the stories that are told?
Yeah, there is one entire chapter, for example, called the Surat Yusuf, the chapter of Joseph, which is about the story of Joseph in Egypt and told very
Right.
beautifully. And so, other characters that show up, Jesus is mentioned a great deal, Adam, Moses, Noah. There's a whole chapter devoted to Mary. There's more about Mary in the Quran than there is in the New Testament. Um, so
Wow.
so there's a great deal of commonality there, and the creation story is told in much the same way that God creates the heavens and the earth in 7 days, that he places Adam and Eve in the garden, that Satan comes and tempts them, and they fall from the garden, and so hence we live in the world that we do. I mean, they don't put as much emphasis on the fall, but the story is repeated multiple times, and it's ascribed to Satan's arrogance. That there is one story that shows up in the Quran multiple times of all of the angels being brought and told to reverence Adam, and they all do except Satan, who says, "No, I'm better than he is. I'm more powerful than he is. Why should I bow down to him?" Well, the answer obviously is because God told you to, but he won't do it, and so for that he's thrust out from the presence of God. He rebels. So those are similar themes, maybe expressed a little bit differently in some cases, but sometimes they're very close. Um, and in fact, Jesus is very, very highly esteemed in the Quran. And so, quite often, when there have been art displays or plays or so on in the United States, anyway, and I think in London as well, that have seemed disrespectful to Jesus, quite often the ones that we will see most out on the streets protesting are Muslims, not the Christians, because they're offended by that. You do not mock prophets. And Jesus is a very great prophet in their view. So there's a lot of intersection. I describe Islam and Christianity and Judaism as cousin religions. We're all what I call Abrahamic religions. All
Mm.
venerate Abraham as the father, the friend of God. That's a Quranic phrase. And so we all derive from him in some regard and look back to and esteem him. The Muslims have another term for it. They don't call them Abrahamic religions. Well, they may. I just haven't seen it, I don't think. But they call them the heavenly religions, the Adyan Samawiya. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, uh, all in that same general basket of heavenly religions, revealed religions.
So was it from Abraham? Was it one of Abraham's sons that, but not with? It was one of his earlier wives,
Yeah,
right? Is that?
Hagar.
Uh, or,
Yeah,
yes, yes, yeah.
yeah.
Is that how that all began, essentially?
Yeah, the tradition is that the Arabs are descendants of Hagar,
Right.
and through Ishmael or by Ishmael. And so they're very proud of their Ishmaelite descent in the old chronologies and genealogies. Interestingly, I remember once when I was teaching an Islamic humanities class, and I used to have Muslim students who would take that class, I think because they thought it would be an easy class for them. And I always had to warn them, it will not be. This is not what you've grown up with. I'm going to be asking you questions you don't know the answers to. So in most cases, they would usually fail the first exam. And I'd say, look, I told you so. You thought you could just waltz in and, not have to study. Well, sorry. But I remember once telling the class that though most Muslims overwhelmingly today believe that the son that Abraham nearly sacrificed was Ishmael, not Isaac. The Bible says Isaac, they say Ishmael. And I said, but the Quran doesn't actually say that. And I had several of them almost rebel. They came up to me afterwards and said, yes, it does. It says Ishmael. And I said, well, find it for me, knowing they couldn't because it's not there. The Quran says he nearly sacrificed Ibnahu, which means his son, but it doesn't name him. And so I checked one of the great classic commentary of At-Tabari, which was the mid 10th century, sort of summarized all the previous commentaries. And the sources he was quoting were about half Ishmael and half Isaac, which means it was still an open question 4 centuries after the coming of the Quran. Nowadays, I think they'd all say Ishmael, but that's more to do with Arab-Israeli politics and ethnic pride than I think anything else. The Quran simply does not answer that question. It just says he nearly sacrificed his son.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
Uh, you know what you mentioned before as well of prophets and um, the reverence they have for prophets.
yeah.
Is it similar considering Latter-day Saints and Muslims? Is it a similar case with revelation, or how do both faiths approach revelation?
For Muslims, overwhelmingly, Muhammad was the last prophet, the Khatam al-Nabiyyin, the seal of
Right.
the prophets, which they tend to take to mean he's the last one. I'm not sure that I see it that way. I think of more like a seal on a letter. In the old days, when a king sent a letter to a subordinate, he would seal it with wax and stamp it with the royal signet. Which meant this is authentic, and if the seal hasn't been broken, then you can trust the orders that are given in this letter. They come from the king. Only he or the Lord Privy Seal has command of that seal. Um, so in that sense, the seal is a sign of authenticity. And almost always when that phrase occurs in the Quran, it's talking about how the Quran confirms what went before, or as the Arabic says, ma baina yadayhim, what is between their hands or between your hands. That is what you've got in front of you. It's confirming those stories are true that you've heard about the prophets and so on. But nevertheless, it's been taken by almost all Muslims that Muhammad is the last. There won't be another one. So there is no large movement in Islam that expects contemporary revelation. Although some will talk about having received spiritual experience. There's a thinker who died in the 11th century, 12th early 12th century, 1111, named Al Ghazali, of whom I'm really fond, and he has the first autobiography in the Islamic world, as far as I'm aware. He tells about how he went through a period of real doubt. And how did he achieve his conviction? Well, through divine inspiration that cast a light into my breast, he says, that I could not deny. Now, he says, I can't give it to you. You have to get it for yourself, but I can tell you the story of how I got it. And, it's the confirmation that prophecy is possible. There is a God, so on and so forth. That's a very uh, resonant passage, I think for Latter-day Saint readers. We would say, yeah, that's the kind of experience we talk about, where suddenly in some way that you can't really transfer, you can tell other people about it, but you can't transfer it to anyone. Then you can say, yeah, I know, I have this assurance. And that is, so that's one area where I think we're on the same page as far as, ongoing revelation goes to individuals. Um, and another powerful point of contact between the Muslim experience as they live it and ours.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything similar to that with the afterlife and how a Muslim believes they would gain salvation.
Yeah. Well, they believe that you have to live the rules. Um, and there are actually things in the Quran that suggest that there are multiple levels in heaven.
Oh,
Um,
right.
yeah, there are places that are closer to God, places that are still in heaven, but not as close to God, further away. And they have to do with degrees of righteousness and so on. So that too, I don't think that Muslims make a great deal of that, but it's strewn throughout the Quran. I'm actually working on a manuscript someday that will appear, I hope, um, where I lay out some of that, because it's really amazing how many clues there are to that kind of thing. And yet I usually hear Muslims talking about simply an-nar, the fire, flame, hell, versus al-jinnah, the garden. But the garden is not one place in the Quran. It's multiple places, very, very different from each other. So to make it to the garden is not necessarily to achieve the highest degree that you could. And the Quran actually uses the word darajat, which means degrees, which is probably in some sense related to our word degree. It's probably a loan word from maybe Latin. So,
Right. Now, I've been thinking a lot in preparation for this interview about the state of these, as they would say, heavenly religions. I really like that term, actually.
mhm.
In dealing with both modernity and secularism increasing in the world, and
Yeah,
traditionally with us, I think our primary issue is with social issues, right?
right,
I would think that would be agreed upon. And when you see people who are against our faith, it's usually because of those social issues and how we deal with them.
right.
Um, and I wonder are there likelihoods in how both of us are dealing with those, you know, modernity and what was that other word I used? My brain's gone. Increased secularism. That
Right,
was it. Are they facing the same issues, or of course, the main thing we see about Islam on the news generally has to do with the issue, especially in the UK. It's all about immigration and it's all about multiculturalism
right.
and the difficulties of fusing the two, and also aggression. And there's a lot of fear around how the media portrays Islam.
Right. I think in the Middle East, in the heartland of Islam, the question of secularism is relatively muted. It hasn't reached those areas to the same degree that it has reached the secular West, Europe and now increasingly North America. Europe was ahead of us in that game, but we're catching up rapidly. Um, but uh, I think that in the heartland of Islam, it's not such an issue. But young Muslims growing up in the West, in the United States, and so on, and in the UK, face those issues very, very much. And I've read studies that indicate that when Muslims immigrate to the West, there are two main responses. Some abandon their religion altogether. They just want to assimilate. They never darken the door of a mosque. But others become more fervent than they had been in their home country, because now this is a tie to their identity. This is an important part where it was just all around you in Egypt or in Pakistan or something like that. But now you're surrounded by secular Westerners and you want to fly the flag, show who you are. And so you become much more um, zealously, even furiously Islamic than you had been when you were living in your home country. And that probably is true among the youth as well, that some just, you know, they chuck it. They say, well, this is the faith of my parents. Well, they're old and they're irrelevant and they don't understand where I live in London or Birmingham or wherever, and they speak with a funny accent and don't understand English very well. So forget them. I'm not interested in, and they become thoroughgoing secularists themselves, who may though adopt certain political goals or political ideologies in lieu of religion. There's a danger that
Yeah.
sometimes politics becomes the idol in place of God. And so I may not be a believing Muslim, but I am very zealously Palestinian or whatever it might be. And that becomes your new devotion. Um, and then there are others who simply, really hold on to the mosque and become very religious and don't fully assimilate into the West. But I think they're facing the same things. And we've had people come to Utah from, for example, the Southern California Muslim community, which is relatively large, wanting to know, well, we want to learn about your youth programs. How do you keep the youth involved? What kinds of things do you do? What can we do to, that you're doing? What can we model from you in our own community? And so they're facing those challenges, I think. And again, it is aggravated by the fact that not only is the older generation older, which is always a barrier to the young, but they're foreign in a way that most Latter-day Saints are not in the UK or in the United States. They're foreign and maybe a little alien to the society that the kids are growing up fully in. So that creates another barrier.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the biggest misconception that Latter-day Saints might have of Islam?
Well, one is that it's a monolith, that it's all one thing, and that if you read about violent Muslims, they're probably all violent and wanting to kill us. And for a while, I went through a period where I had a number of people call me from outlying areas who would say, "There's a mosque being built in my neighborhood. How should I react?" And I said, "Well, you know, the same way that I would always like non-Latter-day Saints to react when we build a chapel or a temple. Welcome it, be tolerant, don't object." Well, what if the imam is a radical? Well, he might be, but the odds are he won't be. And I said, the one thing I would worry about is when they open the mosque, they'll probably have a big dinner and invite people in the neighborhood to come, and you don't want to miss the invitation. So worry about that. So, there is a sense that, oh my word, all Muslims are terrorists. They're all coming to kill us. Well, in fact, the remarkable thing about Islam is how few of them are terrorists. There have been some books on this subject. There's one literally called "Why Are There So Few Muslim Terrorists?" And the author simply looks at the statistics and he says, look, there are 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. How many terrorists are there? A few thousand? At its highest point, ISIS, which actually had a field army, had about 60,000, maybe 80,000 people, but out of a population of globally of 1.6 billion, that's not very many. And so you actually can read the statements of some of the real extremists who complain that most Muslims are not listening to our appeal. Join the cause, fight the jihad against the West. And they're not responding. They're apostates, they're heretics. They're really upset about this. But most Muslims don't want to be part of a war against the West or to be violent. That's not, they're just people who want to raise their children and, make sure their children succeed and live a decent Muslim lifestyle. And that's overwhelmingly the reaction that I've seen from Muslims to that. There are a few out there that are crazy, but most are not. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I've learned from that as well. It's been fascinating to speak with you. I'm so grateful that we were able to do this and that I could learn about Islam and especially Ramadan, as that's been very prominently on my mind recently. And
Right.
yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything that you're planning to work on, or any upcoming exciting projects that you have? I know are you retired now?
I did
You
retire from
mentioned so.
BYU about 2 years ago. But I'm still working. I retired because I wanted to write. And so there are
Right.
projects that I'm working on writing wise. I'm revising a kind of introduction to Islam for a Latter-day Saint audience that was published in 2 editions many, many years ago. But I'm reworking it almost totally. Well, no, the last 2 chapters almost totally. First part, the old history of Islam in the 7th century hasn't changed that much, so I don't need to change that part. But the parts that were dealing with what was the modern Islamic world in the 1990s, early 1990s, well, it's completely different now. So
Right.
I'm working on that. And there's
Were you
another book,
involved with the brochure that the church
just a little bit. Yeah, a
Right.
little bit. Uh-huh. And I welcomed that very much. And then there was an article that I don't know if anybody remembers it. It was in the April 2018 issue of the Ensign. I don't know where else it may have appeared, but I'll mention that because it was a first presidency request that I write it.
Right.
And they took some other poor guy's article out. I don't know who it was, and stuck mine in because they were worried, I think, that they were sensing some Islamophobia among Latter-day Saints, and they wanted to stop it. So this article went in. It's a very simple article. It's very basic, doesn't break any new ground, but to have it in the official church magazine was important. I will not name him, but a certain former counselor in the first presidency, a German, said to me that he thought that was one of the most important things he'd done while he was in the first presidency, was getting that article into the Ensign. So I was
No idea who you're talking
no
about.
no way of figuring it out. But
I'll link to that article though.
yeah,
I'll put a link in the episode description if people
good.
are interested in reading that.
Well, and there's another project that I'm involved in that I hope will work well. It's a series that's coming out of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation in Southern California. And they've already published 2 books. I don't think the third one is out yet. It's Understanding Our Catholic Neighbors, and another one, Understanding Our Jewish Neighbors. And now there's one, Understanding Our Muslim Neighbors. And I've written it's a dialogue between a Latter-day Saint academic and a Muslim equivalent. And I've written the Latter-day Saint part of it. There are some problems with the Islamic part. They're just not pleased with what they've had so far. And so I don't know when that's going to appear, but it's that's in the works as well. And I think that's an important thing. We're asked questions like, well, how is your tradition similar to this other tradition? Both sides answer. How is it different from the other tradition? What do you like about the other tradition? What kind of the question, what do you envy about the other tradition? So it's a very friendly dialogue. And I love that kind of thing. And I hope it comes out and gets a good readership when it comes out, but I can't predict when that will be. So.
Well, I'll look forward to when that does eventually get released. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Daniel.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It was fun.
It was. And have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.